Have you ever found yourself repeatedly thinking about someone who hurt you, even though you know you should be moving on? That feeling of being stuck, emotionally rooted to something you've long since needed to leave behind, is not just unresolved pain, but a call from the unconscious. According to depth psychology, what we cannot abandon carries a hidden message, a forgotten key to our inner transformation. It's not only about the other person, it's about what that bond reveals about ourselves. Sometimes the wound that hurts the most is the one that exposes parts of us we'd rather not face. In this video, you'll discover why, even when every logical argument points toward detachment, your heart still insists on returning to what hurt you. Prepare to plunge into the deepest layers of your psyche. Leave a comment. I choose to free myself and become whole. When we feel trapped by someone who wounded us, we're engaging with a dynamic deeply rooted in the unconscious, one that reveals core aspects of Carl Jung's analytical psychology. Clinging to pain is not an emotional mistake, but a reflection of the complex interplay between shadow, projection, and the process of individuation. The shadow, as Jung described it, represents all those aspects of ourselves we repress or deny. Often, the person who hurts us becomes the mirror of that shadow. They embody traits we judge unacceptable, but that unconsciously are also part of our own psyche. Staying emotionally attached to someone who wounded us can be an unconscious attempt to integrate these rejected parts. Projection also plays a critical role. We deposit onto the other person our expectations, hopes, and unresolved sorrows. When we're betrayed or hurt, we're not only dealing with the real person, but with the collapse of the psychic image we've projected onto them. This collapse plunges us into internal confusion because letting the other go would symbolically mean relinquishing a piece of ourselves. This conflict points straight to individuation, the journey toward inner wholeness. The true challenge isn't forgetting who hurt us, but understanding what that bond is trying to teach our own soul. The integration of animus and anima, the inner masculine and feminine archetypes, may also be at play, especially if the relationship triggered unconscious polarities. Being stuck, then, is a profound invitation to self-inquiry. The wound is the portal, and, as Jung said, what we do not confront in ourselves will be found as fate. When someone hurts us, and yet we remain emotionally bound to them, it's natural to ask ourselves, why can't I stop thinking about them? Or, why does it hurt so much when I know they harmed me? The answer lies in one of the most potent and silent mechanisms of the unconscious: projection. Projection, according to Jung, is a phenomenon in which internal aspects of the psyche, desires, fears, ideals, or traumas, are displaced onto the external world and attributed to others. In love relationships, this mechanism operates with particular force because it's precisely in the realm of affection that we project most intensely what we haven't recognized within ourselves. When we meet someone, we're not only seeing who they are, but also everything we unconsciously project onto them: our hopes for healing, our longing to be seen, our need for approval, or even our ghosts of abandonment and rejection. That's why we often feel emotionally addicted to someone who hurt us. The bond that seems unbreakable doesn't rest solely on the real person, but on the internal image we've created of them, a symbol that usually stands for something far deeper, a forgotten part of ourselves seeking integration. For example, if we project the archetype of the savior or soulmate onto someone, we're actually trying to access an inner sense of completeness we have yet to develop. The other person becomes the emblem of an archetypal desire, and that's what makes disconnection so painful. We lose not only a relationship, but what it symbolized in our inner world. Jung warned that projection is unavoidable at the start of any relationship, yet true emotional health isn't defined by the absence of projection, but by the ability to recognize and gradually withdraw it. As long as we cling to the illusion that the other carries everything we need, love, security, meaning, we remain trapped in emotional dependency. And when that person inevitably falters, revealing their imperfect humanity or causing us pain, the hurt isn't only for the broken bond, but for the unconscious fantasy that supported our projection. Thus, the wound left by someone we idealized tells us more about what remains unhealed within us than about the other person's actions. So when we feel we can't forget or can't move on, it's vital to ask ourselves, what am I really trying to keep alive? Which part of me did this person activate? What did they represent for me beyond who they truly were? Breaking the cycle of projection takes courage and clarity. It requires facing the fact that no one can complete us entirely, and that every expectation we placed on another is in truth a mirror of what we need to find within our own soul. Letting go of projection isn't giving up on love, but reclaiming the autonomy of the soul. It's the beginning of a reunion with the true self, free from the illusions we created to avoid confronting our own incompleteness. At its core, the pain we feel when wounded by someone we idealized is the unconscious calling us to mature emotionally. It's life's invitation to stop seeking outside what can only be built within. When we grasp this, the person who hurt us ceases to be a fallen idol or cruel tormentor and becomes a mirror that, with brutal honesty, revealed where we still need to grow. Every significant emotional pain carries an element of revelation. The moment someone hurts us, especially when an emotional bond is involved, we're thrust into a vulnerability that strips bare aspects of our psyche. Jung called the shadow everything we don't accept in ourselves. Impulses, desires, fears, and traits we deem unacceptable or incompatible with our self-image. Yet what is repressed doesn't vanish. It merely hides, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Few situations are as effective at evoking the shadow as a painful relationship. When someone wounds us, we feel anger, sadness, powerlessness. But beyond these obvious emotions often arises something more unsettling: resentment, envy, jealousy, obsession, even thoughts of revenge. These feelings, which we quickly try to dismiss or disguise, are pure expressions of the shadow coming to life. Instead of acknowledging their presence as a natural part of the human experience, we tend to justify them rationally or lay them entirely at the other's feet. We say that person brought out the worst in us when in reality they only exposed what was always there, dormant, denied, hidden beneath layers of control. That's why certain wounds cut so deeply. They hurt not only because of what was done to us, but because of what they unveiled about ourselves. A relationship that exposes us to rejection, betrayal, or manipulation often stirs up fear of not being good enough. Wounded pride, emotional dependency, repressed anger, or an unconscious desire to control. Each pain touches a hidden part of our personality that we may never have had the courage to face directly. And that exposure creates discomfort, for it dismantles the narrative we constructed about who we are. Jung emphasized that true psychological growth only happens when we can recognize and integrate these shadow aspects. The shadow need not be destroyed, it needs to be welcomed and understood. That means, for example, realizing that our possessiveness might be a reaction to an unresolved ancient abandonment, that our jealousy perhaps reveals deeply rooted insecurities, that the anger we feel toward another might also be anger at having ignored our intuition or betrayed ourselves to maintain the relationship. In relationships, we often project our shadow onto the other. We accuse them of selfishness, coldness, or manipulation without realizing we're dealing with parts of ourselves cast outward. This doesn't justify abusive behavior, but it helps us see that our exaggerated emotional reaction can be rooted in unprocessed internal content. The other person acts as a catalyst. They touch the wound, but don't necessarily create it. Pain then becomes a portal. It forces us to turn inward and notice which parts of ourselves have been ignored or denied. Every difficult emotion carries a key to self-understanding. If we have the courage to listen, name, and feel it without judgment, we take a decisive step toward integrating our shadow. From this process, something begins to transform. The person who once seemed an internal enemy, who occupied our thoughts and drained our energy, loses their power to control us emotionally. This happens not because we forget what occurred, but because we understand what the experience revealed about ourselves. An integrated shadow becomes a source of strength. We act with greater awareness, discernment, and authenticity. A relationship that hurt us can, paradoxically, become the catalyst for a profound reunion with parts of ourselves that lay dormant. And in that reunion, pain ceases to imprison us and instead liberates us. Because, as Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. There are times when we simply cannot move on. The pain settles in, persists, and even after the bond ends, after the other's physical absence, something inside us remains paralyzed. The wound then stops being just a memory and begins to take center stage in our identity. Unknowingly, we start defining ourselves by what we suffered. This phenomenon is more common than it seems, and in Jungian terms reveals a deep, often unconscious process: attachment to the wound. Suffering, especially when not understood and processed, can turn into a psychic identity structure. In other words, the pain starts to tell us who we are. I am the one who was betrayed. I am the one no one chooses. I am the one who loves and is not loved. These inner narratives fix themselves and create a kind of loyalty to the wound. This happens because the unconscious, seeking meaning and stability, prefers to maintain known pain rather than risk the unknown of transformation. The wound, as painful as it is, provides a sense of internal belonging, a familiar existential script. This attachment is often unconscious. It's not that we enjoy suffering, but that we no longer know who we are without that pain. The wound becomes an axis around which our thoughts, behaviors, and choices orbit, and the longer we stay in that cycle, the harder it becomes to imagine an emotional life free of that burden. Suffering becomes comfortable to the extent that it's predictable and familiar, and it absolves us to some degree from the responsibility of change. Jung warned that the unconscious seeks wholeness, not comfort. When we cling to our wound, we interrupt the natural flow of individuation, the process of becoming whole. We keep repeating patterns, attracting similar situations, maintaining dysfunctional relationships, all to feed the internal story we've built around our suffering. And the most disturbing part is that this often happens with symbolic logic. The unconscious tries to resolve the original trauma by creating repetitions, hoping that this time we'll act differently. But if we remain unconscious, we only reaffirm the wound. The solution lies in a radical process of awareness. We must identify the narrative we're feeding. What role has this pain assumed in our life? How has it defined us? What do we gain unconsciously by staying tied to this suffering? These questions aren't easy, but they're essential. When we face head-on our attachment to the wound, we begin to see that behind the pain lies a profound plea for recognition, not from another but from ourselves. The key is to transform suffering into meaning. This doesn't mean justifying pain or romanticizing trauma, but acknowledging that the lived experience can be transmuted into self-knowledge. Pain stops being identity when we use it as a passage to consciousness. When we cease to define ourselves by what happened to us and start defining ourselves by who we're becoming. This inner shift is not instantaneous. It demands presence, support, time, and above all, a sincere willingness to relinquish the role of victim, not to deny suffering, but to stop being its prisoner. It's also in this process that we find the seed of forgiveness, not necessarily as an act toward another, but as an internal liberation. In this context, forgiving means removing the wound's power to dictate our choices. It's a symbolic act of disentangling ourselves from the trauma. When we can recall the pain without merging with it, we initiate the true healing process. So when we feel we can't forget, when the pain seems greater than time or reason, it's likely we're dealing not only with the memory of someone, but with the internalization of an identity built on the wound. And breaking free from that identity may be the hardest and most liberating challenge of all. The cycle of repetition is a subtle psychic trap. We live painful experiences, vow never again to allow anything similar, and yet in different forms we attract or involve ourselves in situations that reproduce the same emotional patterns. This doesn't happen out of weakness or inattention, but out of an unconscious need to resolve something still fragmented within our psyche. At this point, the concept of individuation, central to Jung's work, becomes essential for understanding the path to emotional freedom. Individuation is the process by which the individual becomes who they truly are. It is an internal journey of integrating the psyche's polarities, conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, animus and anima, toward a more authentic wholeness. Rather than seeking answers outside ourselves, individuation invites us to dive within, acknowledge our deepest contents, and transform pain into wisdom. Within this process, repeating painful patterns isn't a failure, but a call from the unconscious to awaken. When we feel stuck by someone who hurt us, we're often facing a symbolic repetition. That person, that bond, represents more than the relationship itself. It symbolizes a psychic standstill. That figure might embody the absence of an emotionally available father, the rejection of a critical mother, or even our own refusal to take responsibility for our choices. The unconscious, by placing us again before similar figures, is trying to show us something that needs integration. But without awareness, the tendency is to react the same way, reinforcing the wound and strengthening identification with suffering. Liberation begins when we recognize that the person who hurt us no longer holds power over us, except the power we unconsciously grant them. Anger, longing, resentment, all of it is real, but none of it needs to be eternal. Jung stated that the unconscious manifests through symbols, and that understanding these symbols is part of healing. In that sense, the other becomes a symbol. They are not merely an ex-partner, a friend who betrayed us, or a lost love. They are the embodiment of something far broader, an unresolved aspect within ourselves. Breaking the cycle of repetition requires more than willpower. It calls for surrender to the process of self-knowledge. It involves revisiting our stories, recognizing patterns of attachment, the fears that prevent us from letting go, and the beliefs that sustain the idea that we need another to feel whole. Many of these beliefs were formed in childhood and solidified over time. Individuation requires us to confront these narratives and gradually stop repeating them so that we can start choosing consciously. Integrating animus and anima, the inner masculine and feminine archetypes, is also part of this liberation. When these aspects are imbalanced, we tend to seek in another what we lack within ourselves. For example, a woman projecting her animus might feel drawn to authoritarian or absent men, unconsciously trying to integrate her own power to act. A man projecting his anima might bind himself to idealized women, seeking in them the sensitivity he suppresses in himself. These unconscious projections perpetuate frustration. Individuation calls us to withdraw these projections and develop internally the qualities we sought outside. Emotional freedom, then, is not about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering without identifying. It's about looking back and acknowledging that what hurt us also shaped us, revealed our limits, our illusions, and our strength. It's about no longer being a hostage to another, but taking authorship of our own path. The pain that repeats itself wants to teach us something we have not yet understood. When we finally listen, the repetition loses its meaning. Then freedom ceases to be a distant promise and becomes a possible reality, not because the other changed, but because we changed. This is true emotional transcendence, an internal, silent, transformative movement in which pain ceases to function as a prison and becomes a bridge. A bridge between who we were in suffering and who we can become in awareness. The journey we've traveled here isn't about forgetting who hurt us, but about understanding why that wound became so hard to abandon. In the light of Jungian analytical psychology, we've seen that emotional pain is not a mistake, but a call to self-knowledge. The bond with someone who hurt us often reveals projections, activates our shadow, shapes an identity based on the wound, and traps us in repetitive cycles that only the process of individuation can transcend. Every intense emotion, every insistent memory, every difficulty in moving on is actually a symbolic opportunity for integration. Pain only transforms when it stops being denied and starts being heard. The one who hurt us may never grasp the full impact they had, but we can choose to transform that impact into inner strength. If this content touched you in some way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue following deep reflections on self-knowledge and personal transformation. And now, click on the video appearing on your screen. It's the next step in this journey toward reconnecting with your true self. Your emotional freedom begins when you decide not to flee from pain, but to pass through it with awareness.